everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be diving into something really powerful, maybe secret, the truth behind Russia's war when the cameras are off. Like, kind of really wonder, what is it like when the cameras are off? Do the soldiers go back happy? Do they go back celebrating? Do they go back proud? Do they go back excited? Or do they go back broken, lost, and unfulfilled? What is it like when the cameras are really off? All right, if you're curious enough, sit back and let's dive right in.
Russian state television frequently broadcasts footage of frontline action that presents its military as technologically and numerically superior. It also shows triumphant soldiers returning home to their families, with carefully choreographed scenes of tearful reunions, medal ceremonies, and grateful communities welcoming back their heroes. Putin's propaganda machine works overtime to paint a picture of noble warriors supposedly defending the motherland, coming home to prosperity and respect. But turn off the cameras and the reality is catastrophically different. Behind the veneer of state-sponsored heroism lies
Behind the cameras, it's catastrophically different. Does it mean that what we see is not what it really is? This is getting more and more interesting.
As a human-created catastrophe that reveals the true cost of Putin's war, both in human lives and money. Some Russian soldiers aren't just dying on Ukrainian battlefields, but they're also destroying Russian society when they come home. In the 3 years since the full-scale invasion started, veterans from the front have killed and maimed more than 750 people after returning home. Most often, their victims were relatives and friends, and most of the crimes were of a domestic nature. These numbers might look staggering, but they represent something far worse than statistics. They reveal a system that has weaponized its own people, created economic incentives that benefit only the military and political elite, and is systematically cannibalizing Russia's future for short-term military gains. Let's examine exactly what happens to Russian soldiers when the
This is really horrible. I still find it, I'm trying to digest this whole story, this whole thing, this whole idea. Is it really true? Because it's so hard to believe. No, it can't be, right? It can't.
cameras stop rolling. According to the Kremlin itself, almost 140,000 Russian soldiers have returned to civilian life after fighting in the war against Ukraine by mid-2025. For reference, when the war actually started, Russia was estimated to have 300,000 troops being deployed in the first year. However, the reintegration support the Russian media frequently mentions when referring to returning soldiers is actually a bureaucratic euphemism for what amounts to a social disaster in the making. Many of these veterans are expected to suffer from PTSD and may also exhibit violent tendencies, according to the Center for European Policy Analysis and various news outlets, specifically Medusa, a Lithuanian-based Russian independent news channel. The channel's team spoke with specialists working on rehabilitation programs for Russian war veterans, using the investigation conducted by the independent journalist Farida Rustamova, who is also a former Medusa reporter, as a major source for their claims. The sources predict a range of major societal issues, including rampant drug and alcohol abuse. This comes from the fact that Russia is unlikely to provide prolonged medical and psychological support for soldiers who have suffered extreme or debilitating injuries, which are usually what allowed them to be discharged from the military in the first place. Considering that the Russian military has disproportionately targeted rural areas for its recruitment drives, these returning soldiers are already at a higher risk of being alcohol abusers, faced with the prospect of returning to daily life with a vital body part missing and potentially seeing hundreds of their compatriots die on the front line.
This whole story, I haven't gone deep into it, but it's really contradictory compared to the triumphantly painted picture of Russian soldiers. It's really contradictory to kind of, have to start digesting this whole ideology that what we see, it's not really what it is. It's so contradictory. I just hope this isn't really what it is.
Line, these soldiers would need extensive support for years, something that Russia might not be able to provide. And the scale of the mental health issues is staggering. Russia's defense ministry has estimated that 1 in 5 war veterans suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. At the same time, Russia has fewer than 1 therapist for every 7,000 adults, and even fewer of them have experienced treating combat trauma. Granted, the Russian government's response reveals that at least some of its priorities lie in trying to alleviate the negative effects of the war on its people. For example, Russia's Defenders of the Fatherland Foundation has received tens of billions of rubles to support veterans of the war against Ukraine and their families. Its regional offices help returning soldiers access housing, medical care, and other benefits. This is compounded by Russia providing hundreds of thousands of rubles to soldiers who are declared to be severely injured in the war, with the payout reaching up to 4 million rubles, roughly $35,000, in August 2025, which can be more than the soldier would make in half a year or even a year of a military contract. But these economic measures are by themselves revealing the scale of the demographic issues in Russia. While the soldiers and veterans receive ruble upon ruble of compensation and assistance, the rest of the population, including orphans, people with disabilities, and the seriously ill, often face years of waiting for benefits they're legally entitled to, or are more commonly simply left to fend for themselves.
I never thought a day would come when I would have to say something like this, but despite the differences between Russia and Ukraine, if you go beyond the regional nature, the Russians are regionally separate from Ukrainians. But when you go higher above this, like let's say higher above it, there's one thing that we all share in common as humans, and that is being human. You can't be anything else outside of human. We are all humans at the end of the day, at the end of these battles, at the end of this crisis over disputes, over lands, and all those differences. But at the end of this all, we are humans. That is what we should put in mind first before setting out for any war or any battle or any dispute or crisis. At the end of it all, we are human. So if this value for humanity is in there, then what is left? What becomes of the future? This is 21st century and human lives are getting more and more devalued. Really? Is this what we're setting our future up for? Outside of it, we are human. So even if we don't consider the fact that we have differences which are just below the general ideology of being humans, we are all humans. So I guess the respect for that, for a human life, will contribute a whole lot into saving more lives, because this is totally horrible. I mean, look at these men leaving their homeland, leaving the comfort of their homes, their families, going out there to fight and kill other people who have families. And not just fight, let's say they're fighting against their opponents. Maybe probably they are trained to fight against their opponents. But then what happens to their colleagues who get killed, who get hurt in the process of these battles? What becomes of their fate? How would you sit and look at someone you were speaking with a couple of minutes ago only to turn back and say that either parts of their body has disappeared or their entire body gone or they are no more? How would you come home living with that thought? Is it that they are trained to live with this trauma, to live with this reality, this horrible, horrible reality? Please, let's all consider the fact that we are all humans and we need to value human life despite the differences, despite our skins, despite our cultures or regional differences. We are humans and that comes first. It is above every other thing.
This preferential treatment creates a two-tier society where military service becomes the only pathway to basic social services, and one that is also open to corruption and abuse. This creates multiple problems, starting from the simple fact that Russia's economic measures only incentivize its population to enlist in the military and keep the war going. Then the military-industrial complex, energy and trade with countries like China and India all depend on Russia being cut off from the rest of the world economically and geopolitically. The cycle of dependence on war and close allies perpetuates, with Putin unwilling to propose a reasonable peace deal simply because it's in his best interest to continue the war, to maintain the illusion that people are getting the social services common in developed countries and which have now become out of reach for large swathes of the population. But not all soldiers get the help or assistance they need, or they fail to properly reintegrate into their environment after their return. This one has a fairly predictable outcome, turning to crime. The explosion of veteran-related crime isn't an unfortunate side effect of war, it's a direct consequence of how Russia conducts its military operations. Observers from the Jamestown Foundation studying the effects of returning veterans from the war against Ukraine are drawing parallels to those who returned from the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, who are known as Afghantsi. These soldiers played a large role in increasing crime in Russia near the end of the Soviet Union. But this time, the scale is exponentially larger. While the Soviet-Afghan War lasted for a decade, the actual deployment of Soviet troops was much lower, with an estimate of only 620,000 soldiers being deployed throughout the war. This is helped by the fact that the Soviet-Afghan War was much less deadlier overall, with only 15 to 25,000 fatalities suffered by the Union Army. In contrast, it's estimated that Russia has suffered 1 million total casualties by the end of the third year of the war in February 2025, and that the active deployment is around 700,000 troops and National Guard members. If we go through these numbers a bit more, it's safe to estimate that around 1.5 to 2 million Russian soldiers have been in Ukraine at one point over the last 3.5 years. And while it's uncertain how many of these soldiers are actually making it home, as opposed to dying or being counted as a casualty, recovering, then being placed back into service, the number involved is likely going to be much higher than that of the Soviet-Afghan War. If these veterans, referred to as 𝐋𝐈𝐊𝐄, join forces with nationalist politicians who want the Kremlin to pursue more expansionist policies, they could have a significant impact on local policies and security within both major population centers and small towns. The recruitment of convicted criminals has made the situation even worse. The independent media outlet Verstka found that at least 190 criminal cases were initiated against pardoned Wagner recruits in 2023. These ex-convicts, trained in modern warfare and released into society with legal impunity, represent a law enforcement nightmare. This has led to what some experts are calling the Wagnerization of Russia's underworld. Organized crime groups are recruiting former soldiers as contract killers or bodyguards, prompting rivals to do the same and escalating a criminal arms race. This ties back into the aforementioned lack of support for mental health inside the country. And when these veterans commit crimes and stand trial, they often receive lighter sentences with their service to the motherland taken into account. Moscow has also introduced a new law against discrediting the Russian armed forces. Initially, the law basically prevented independent journalism from being conducted to investigate the actions of the Russian military as a whole. But as crackdowns on freedom of speech continued, some people might be afraid of the potential consequences of reporting crimes committed by returning veterans. This further perpetuates the aforementioned cycle. Military service is one of the only ways to get the assistance you need, and yet that same military service can drastically increase the crime rate in urban areas, while also making those soldiers practically untouchable in the eyes of the law. Of course, the actual military service is far from sunshine and daisies for the average soldier. Faced with a lack of progress on pretty much every front, Russia has resorted to using obsolete human wave attacks to save up on precious military equipment and ammunition, the stockpiles for which have been heavily targeted by Ukraine. Using basic infantry as the only way to attack a country with layered defenses and perhaps the world's most advanced drone network is basically suicide for a large portion of the units involved. And there is regular news that suggests complete breakdown of Russian attacks in the absence of actual high-grade gear. This stems from the utterly broken Soviet military doctrine that is heavily centralized and practically negates any responsibility or strategic relevance of commissioned officers near the front line. Instead, Russian strategy depends on predetermined plans that aren't adaptable enough to matter, given increased surveillance and intelligence sharing between Ukraine and the West. This leaves Russian soldiers in a practically impossible situation. Getting deployed to the front means a high likelihood of death. Not enlisting at all precludes them from vital government support plans. And when fleeing the country altogether has become out of reach, some Russian deserters have resorted to a new tactic to avoid being sent to war: getting locked up. They and their lawyers must create cases that would result in actual sentences that would preclude them from ever serving in the military in the first place. Of course, even this isn't a surefire way to escape the war, as Russia has already relied on tens of thousands of convicts to bolster its military figures. Those who don't take that route in an effort to be discharged from the military or simply run away. According to an iStories investigation, at least 49,000 Russian soldiers deserted from February 2022 to May 2025. For those who can't escape through desertion, surrender to Ukrainian forces becomes the preferred option. At least then, Ukrainian holding prisons for prisoners of war have been considered to have much more favorable conditions than Russian ones. This represents the ultimate failure of military morale, when soldiers would rather surrender to the enemy than continue serving their own country. But beyond the psychological effect of the war on individual soldiers, the true failure of the war is Russia's new economic status, or lack thereof. The war economy that
49,000. So which means even the Russian soldiers are getting tired of this whole thing. They are getting tired of this whole battle. It's really crazy. So why can't they just call this to peace? You know, at some point I felt like maybe one should actually applaud Russia, because it's Russia here, Russia there, Russia here, Russia. Like, it's the only name you hear in the social world today. Is the only country that is being mentioned whenever crisis arises. In any part of Europe, is either Russia this or Russia here, Russia there. That is the only name you're hearing. How do they do it? Like, how do they do it? And they are still standing strong till today. One country against the whole of Europe. I kind of like, I'm going to really applaud them for this. But really, there's this adage, an African adage that says that a child that doesn't allow the mother to sleep doesn't sleep. All right. So Russia doesn't allow the European countries to rest. Then that means Russia definitely won't rest. And how do they do it? Putting up with all of these countries. Russia is up against virtually all the European countries. How do they do it? And I mean, the soldiers that are being recruited into this military to battle against their fellow countries, how do they survive? How do they live afterwards? Do they get proud about it, or do they, like, how do you just live in constant crisis with your neighbors? How do you survive it? You can't even relate with people freely except it is war. So what is it? What is this about, really? Is this the nature of this country, or this is just there's something that nobody knows about? And now the soldiers are getting fed up. They are getting tired. They want to run away. Some are locking themselves up and they are running away from this whole battle. And yet, what is the president doing about this? What is it doing about this? Like, yes, this is where the painful reality hits me so hard that you get to see that the soldiers that go to this battle, they suffer, their families suffer, their children suffer. Some of them never return back to raise the kids they gave birth to. Some of them never return back to their homes, to their wives, to their families, to their children. But the one person who sits there, or let's say the elite who sits there planning this whole battle, pushing them further, you don't find them in the battlefield. I mean, gone are the days when kings go to war to save their countries and prove their worth as the kings. But now you see presidents, leaders of countries sitting at home and sending soldiers to go to war, and they are not even willing to back down. They are not willing to resolve. You don't fight to stay in battle, you fight to resolve. I mean, after war comes peace. But in this case, it seems as though there is no space for peace after all of this war. What is this war about? Where is the peace in this? They are not coming to a common resolution. So when is the peace gonna come up?
The war economy that Putin has created appears to benefit soldiers financially, but it's actually a sophisticated form of economic colonization that extracts wealth from Russia's future to fund present destruction. Monthly wages primarily depend on rank and combat participation, but the starting monthly wages have been estimated to be roughly 3 times the average for the country. This is compounded by generous recruitment bonuses, which in some cases constitute 6 to 9 months of the already inflated salary. These increased payments are intended to boost recruitment without resorting to unpopular mobilization efforts, and are the main reason why Putin seems to keep finding hundreds of thousands of men to recruit year in year out for the war. And even then, the number of people who get the sign-up bonuses seem to be steadily decreasing. Medusa found out that the second quarter of 2025 had more than a third of soldiers sign the contract compared to figures from the same period in the previous year. The apparent prosperity of offering higher salaries to soldiers is also built on a foundation of economic destruction. Russia's defense and security spending for 2025 is projected to be 7.5% of GDP and account for 40% of total federal expenditure, a record not seen since the Soviet Union's Cold War era. In parallel, spending on social welfare policy is projected to decrease by nearly 16% year on year. The government is essentially bribing soldiers with money stolen from Russia's civilian population and future generations. To accommodate these priorities, the government has also announced it would reduce transfers to the Pension and Social Insurance Fund by 1.4 trillion rubles, or more than $17 billion in 2025. This creates massive distortions throughout the economy. The war economy is draining talent and resources from essential public services. Healthcare and education are suffering acute staff shortages, outdated infrastructure, and a lack of investment. These problems are particularly severe in rural and less developed regions where services have deteriorated to crisis levels. The financial incentives for military service create another layer of problems for returning soldiers. Given that military personnel have by now been accustomed to earning millions of rubles per year, they will be reluctant to take low-paying jobs once the war ends, and many will be left without money. This significant decline in their standard of living is expected to drive many toward crime. Meanwhile, Russian authorities claim that only 57% of 137,000 demobilized soldiers had found employment by May 2025. But according to Defense 24 and Radio Svoboda, most of these jobs are in security or manual labor, paying just 40,000 to 60,000 rubles, or $474 to $710,000 a month, around 1.5 to 2.5 times the minimum wage. While it might be a coincidence, there's a chance this is a deliberate strategy to create dependency on military service. Workers who earned over 200,000 rubles or $2,405 per month in combat zones won't be able to psychologically adjust to earning 50,000 rubles, $590 in civilian jobs. The government has essentially created a military caste that can only maintain its standard of living through continued warfare. And while soldiers receive preferential treatment, ordinary Russians face systematic abandonment by their government. In March 2025, British military intelligence revealed that 160 Russian hospitals were closed in the previous year, probably because medical resources were being redirected from the civilian to the military sector. Putin's war economy is also consuming Russia's demographic future. As it stands, Russia's army represents 3% of the country's labor force, which has roughly doubled since 2020. Working-age men are systematically removed from the available pool of workers, with nobody to replace them. And this gets worse when you consider the broader demographic impact. The Russian Federation suffered one of its lowest fertility rates right in the middle of the 1990s due to the economic fallout of the breakup of the Soviet Union. At that point, the fertility rate dropped to 1.4 or even 1.2 before only slightly bouncing back to 1.8, which is still below replacement level. When you combine this with the estimated 1 million casualty count over the 3 years, there's an entire generation of men that either didn't exist in the first place or are being actively exterminated in the war. That same generation won't be able to become part of the workforce or contribute to population growth, essentially creating a hole in Russia's demographics that would take decades to patch up. The casualties make the demographic impact even more severe. Based on Western estimates of Russian casualties approaching 1 million killed and wounded, an entire generation of young men has been removed from Russia's economic and social life. This isn't just a temporary wartime sacrifice, it's permanent demographic damage that will affect Russia for decades. And as their quality of life declines, former soldiers
Value for it. When is this going to end?
are also expected to take out loans en masse, something which is practically impossible to do when the country's banks have forecast liquidity problems and are entering a structural deficit. This will accelerate the economic death spiral for many veterans who haven't been able to serve in the military for long enough to save money and transfer it home, as well as those who have medical bills and rehabilitation to pay. The ultimate irony of Russia's war economy is that it's created prosperity for the very people destroying Russia's future while impoverishing everyone else. Military contractors, defense industry executives, and government officials benefit from the massive spending, while ordinary Russians see their healthcare, education, and social services systematically defunded. Meanwhile, the projected Russian military and government budget is under constant threat from factors that it can't really control. The EU, G7, and Australia are instituting a price cap on Russian oil and gas, which aims to further reduce the potential income from one of the only remaining profitable industries in the country. The oil prices also depend on the overall global market, which Russia is a relatively small part of at this point. And the longer the mobilizations go on, the more workers are being taken out of the labor pool. The returning soldiers are not a net positive on the country's budget, as they are now receiving benefits or being a burden on the country's social and healthcare systems. Each passing month also increases the scale of Western sanctions, which Russia has only been able to avoid through its trade with China. But that can also be affected if the West decides to go after China again. For example, most Chinese banks no longer trade in rubles in fear of being cut off from trading in the US dollar, as retaliation for conducting business with Russia. The proxy trade war between the West and Russia through China is also forcing China into an uncomfortable position where it has to maintain a facade of neutrality while openly supporting Russia as its biggest ally. Putin has created an economic model that can only survive through continued warfare. Peace would expose just how severe Russia's economic and demographic problems are and force the government to confront the massive social problems it has created. But on the flip side, admitting that there's a problem sends a clear signal to the few remaining allies that Russia has that it's no longer a viable partner. Considering how heavily Russia depends on exporting its oil and gas to giants like China or India, at least profitably, losing them as strategic partners could sever one of the last remaining lifelines for the country. Russia might end up winning the war, but it will likely bankrupt itself to rule over a country that it had to decimate, putting itself into even deeper demographic and political issues in the process. The result could very well be the end of the Russian Federation as we know it today and of Putin's regime, and after that, there's no telling what might happen to the world order. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to know more about what might happen if Putin is actually deposed, check out this video. And to stay up to date with the most recent events in global warfare and geopolitics, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.
It's kind of crazy where Russia has found herself today. Because I feel so heartbroken. I feel so sad for the Russians. If this is really true and if this is what really Russia is becoming of, I feel so sad because they are humans. Despite everything, they are humans and nobody deserves to suffer like this. And the future that lies ahead is really bleak and blurry. It's crazy. What you hide is what kills you, really. And silence is the worst crime ever. Not speaking up. Silence is the worst crime. So if this is the silent part of Russia, if this is the silent part of this war, if this is the secret cost of this war, then it is going to be worse than winning the war itself. Because at the end of it, you'll find that the, the, the reason this war was put out there is less than the gain. The gain is less than what it actually cost. Okay, so it will be like the beginning of the end. The end of the war might just be the beginning of another internal war that no one can actually predict when it will be over. Because I'm really heartbroken right now and I feel so sad for Russians. And yes, my heart goes to the Ukrainians. I don't know what it is on the other side of Ukraine due to the cost of this war. But I just pray for peace between these two countries because war isn't something anybody wants to experience. Whatever the differences are, at the end of it all, this the leaders should be able to see beyond their differences and understand that the citizens are suffering from this cost of this war and they should be able to work something out to resolve their differences and settle in as close neighbors, as a family, because these are European countries, close neighbors. So at the end of it, they should be able to resolve into something really that really works for both of them. I don't understand why it is so hard for these countries to come together and figure something out. Look beyond their differences, look beyond the pain, look beyond the cost or the losses or their gains or their interest. But also see the fact that the citizens are really suffering from the pain that has been imposed on them due to the cost of this war. That human lives are being lost, properties are being destroyed, a lot of things are going wrong. The future, where do they stand from here even after the war? I know that when war comes, there's peace after war. If you want peace, if you want peace, you first of all you go to war. So when you're done with the war, when is it gonna end? Okay, please, guys, let me know your thoughts on this. But I feel really sad for both Russians and Ukrainians because I know that beyond these borders, beyond this military phase, beyond these cameras, there is way too much going on in the lives of civilians. They are suffering. All right. Wherever two elephants fight, the grasses suffer the most. And the grasses here are the civilians. And I know it's really weighing heavily on them. So, guys, please, whatever the cause is, put aside your differences and look beyond your interest. This the citizens are really suffering and there's appearing to be that there won't be any future from here for them. So please let me know your thoughts on this down in the comments and until my next video, stay alive, stay positive, stay in peace, and stay away from war, most importantly. All right, peace, peace, peace and love, peace and love.